Good morning, Father Michael Butler.
Why, good morning, Paul Robson. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. It's good to have you on, and we're going to be recording another episode of As Iron Sharpens Iron today. We're going to be looking at the Royal Path. We've noticed there's a couple of differences sometimes in our opinions, and so we thought it was a good way of framing a conversation about how to find our way as Orthodox Christians in divisive times where there's all kinds of issues that are cross-cutting across all kinds of normal, areas of community and connection that are splitting people, even in my own parish, a lot of the time in new ways. And I don't think we're finished with it yet, especially as we're heading into even more chaotic times. So I'm going to give a short summary of what we're going to talk about, then we're going to dive in. But first of all, I just want to mention that we are not that far, getting closer and closer to the second annual retreat being held in Detroit, the Cry of the Forerunner. Do you want to say something about that, Father Michael?
Yeah, we had a great time last year with the Beloved Sons retreat. We had a lot of guys come out, a number of guys who listened to As Iron Sharpens Iron. In fact, it was transformative for a number of the men who were there. We had a really, really good time. I think it was a very successful event. So we're going to try to do better, even better this year. And this year's retreat will be completely different. It's called the Cry of the Forerunner because we're going to base it on the life and on the preaching of St. John the Baptist, who has some really deep lessons for us as men to learn, especially in our walk with Christ and to help us to grow up in faith. So that will be the subject of it. I will be there presenting. Paul will be there presenting. Father Hans Jacobsi will be back with us again, also presenting. So we'll have some great sessions. We've got some Orthodox worship, of course, the services for the weekend. We'll have some exercises to do. We'll have a little bit of fun, a little bit of goofing off, lots of time for good fellowship, getting to know other like-minded men. And yeah, that's the sum of the retreat. And for the guys who are able to stay over through Sunday night, of course, the 17th annual male bonding party, which is the best party of the year, if I say so myself.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to experiencing that again with you and Father Hans, not least. And then
Yeah.
also seeing again, we had a little pilgrimage to the monastery of St. John the Baptist in the UK
Yes.
this summer, and a whole lot of guys came there that we're going to see again there. I'm actually now, I'll just put in here, organizing now a retreat to Mount Athos
Oh,
in
sweet.
October. And I've just been overwhelmed. I'm actually going to be filling up places quite quickly. I've had people that I wouldn't have even thought would join that have been joining there as well. So I'm also really excited about like just coming together and meeting people more. I think we made that our goal actually last year on this podcast, is to be talking more and engaging more in real in-person relating with men who want to step up and recover Orthodox Christian masculinity. So I'm really
There
happy
you
with that.
go. And that was a number of comments. That was something that the men who came to the retreat last year, it was a very, very common thing. Wow, I see these guys on YouTube. I talk to these guys on Zoom calls, on different Orthodox men's groups and what, but to sit down with them in person and to get to
Mhm.
know them, it was so much better. We sort of all know that, but it's really a deepening and an enriching experience to sit down, break bread,
Mhm.
with the guys that you sort of know only virtually. And it really builds a depth of Orthodox fellowship that we don't get otherwise. Because virtual reality ain't reality. And we can do much better than an audio podcast or a YouTube video or something like that. We're called to be in unity and to worship together and to spend time in each other's company. So it's a good opportunity to do it. Guys, if you're at all able, come to the retreat. There a link to find out more information is going to be in the show notes there. So just click on that. If you have any further questions, you can ask questions there.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so Father Michael, what we're going to do now is we found a little text from an article written by Fr Seraphim Rose in his publication Orthodox Word, where there's just so many great things that we have a little extract that Father Michael's going to read up and comment a little bit on for us, and then we're actually going to take a conversation about an issue which splits people in Orthodoxy, sometimes even today as well. And we're going to have a little short conversation about ways of looking at that, where I think we also coming from slightly different perspectives.
Mhm.
And then what we're also going to do, I actually recently read a quote from St. Paisios of Athos, someone who asked him, who should I vote for in this election? And, what if I just think that all of these politicians are equally
No,
terrible, that I
yeah.
don't feel like voting for any of them? How do I handle that? And so what does that mean following the Orthodox path? How do we stay engaged as Orthodox Christian? How are we men taking responsibility, not just for ourselves, but for those around us as well, and doing so as godly men as well. So I found that really valuable to hear what St. Paisios said. He had a little metaphor of growing olive trees on that issue. So I can share that with you guys as well. So do you want to dive us straight into the text, Father Michael?
Yeah, this is let me see. First off, this is from a little article by Fr Seraphim Rose called "The Royal Path: True Orthodoxy in an Age of Apostasy." So that's the source of it, and here are like three paragraphs out of it where he talks to the fathers, and I'll just quote it and maybe riff a little along the way. So Fr Seraphim begins. It is of critical importance, therefore, that this voice be actually one of true, that is, patristic orthodoxy. So he's talking about how the church speaks to contemporary issues this way. So he wants the voice of the church needs to be patristic and grounded in the fathers, of course, and in the tradition and all. Unfortunately, it sometimes happens, especially in the heat of controversy, that basically sound orthodox positions are exaggerated on one side and misunderstood on the other. And thus an entirely misleading impression is created in some minds that the cause of true orthodoxy today is a kind of extremism, a sort of right-wing reaction to the prevailing left-wing course now being followed by the leaders of the official Orthodox churches. Footnote here, please remember, Fr Seraphim was writing in the 70s and 80s when communism still held Eastern Europe, where relationships between like the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia and what is now the Orthodox Church in America and some of the other Russian jurisdictions were at enmity, and we were not in communion, and there was some hostility between various Orthodox factions and all. Plus, there was a huge move in the bad old communist days for the Orthodox Church to be engaged in ecumenical activities. This was because very often those were the only activities, for example, that representatives from the Russian church under communist rule in Russia, the only time they were able to leave their country and meet with Orthodox leaders outside of the Soviet bloc or outside of communist countries. Without a little bit of this historical perspective, we're wondering, kind of what was the big deal? And maybe it was organizations like the World Council of Churches that was the only way that, for example, Orthodox Christians in America could engage with hierarchs and priests from Russia or from Serbia or from other communist bloc countries at all. And so a lot of times those churches were criticized. Oh, you're engaged in ecumenism, pan-heresy of ecumenism, all that. I don't think they really cared about ecumenism. They just wanted to be able to sit down with Orthodox Christians outside of their own country and engage with them. And that was just not possible unless they went through channels that the Soviet government required them to go through. And yeah, they said stupid things that their masters said they had to say. But I think a lot of great good was in fact accomplished when they were able to sit down with representatives from the church in Greece or Cyprus or in Western Europe or in America and all. So anyway, that's a little bit of the background. So, when we're talking about, left-wing course followed by the leaders of official Orthodox churches, this is because Fr Seraphim was a member of ROKOR, of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, which was not in communion with the Patriarchate of Moscow at that time, and saw the efforts of the Moscow Patriarchate as somewhat liberal because of its ecumenical involvement. All right,
and Father Seraphim himself, right? He also took this kind of like hard right-wing course early on in his life, and then later realized especially with this article expressed how he saw the error of taking a very hard liner. It's the heart that's important again, right? I guess that's what we're getting to.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can read, even if you read, I think it's evident even in that huge volume of the life of Fr Seraphim Rose by Father Damascene. I think it's even evident in there if you read from beginning to end, you'll see the evolution of Fr Seraphim's thought and its ripening, and there's a maturity that leads to what's being talked about in this article here. Anyway, to go back to the paragraph, such a political view of the struggle for true orthodoxy today is entirely false. This struggle, on the contrary, has taken the form among its best representatives today, whether in Russia, Greece, or the diaspora, of a return to the patristic path of moderation, a mean between extremes. This is what the Holy Fathers call the royal path. Okay, the basis and the background of this goes back to ancient Greek philosophy, where Plato and Aristotle said that virtue is the mean, that is the midpoint between two excesses, either too little or too much on one side or the other. And vice, evil, comes in excess. And so, as the Greeks said, famously, mizon ariston, moderation is the best. They're not talking about out of a scale of 0 to 100, better to be only at 50%. They're not talking about a watered down effort or a half done approach to anything. No, they're thinking more in terms of a bell curve. Where is optimal? And optimal is not going to be too much on one side or too little on the other side. It's going to be very near the mean or in the middle. And that's the royal path. And that's very common among the fathers to talk about the royal path in this way. Always to seek the moderation, not too much of this, not too little of it, but find a spot in the middle. Okay? So, Father Seraphim goes on. The teaching of this royal path is set forth, for example, in the 10th of St. Abba Dorotheus's spiritual instructions, where he quotes especially the book of Deuteronomy, which says, "Ye shall not turn aside to the right hand nor to the left, but go by the royal path." You want the reference, that's Deuteronomy chapter 5, verse 32, and Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 11. And St. Basil the Great says, "Upright of heart is he whose thought does not turn away either to excess or to lack, but is directed only to the mean of virtue." But perhaps this teaching is most clearly expressed by the great Orthodox father of the 5th century, St. John Cassian, who was faced with a task not unlike our own Orthodox task today, to present the pure teaching of the Eastern Fathers to Western peoples. St. John Cassian was an Eastern monk. He ended up in southern France, in Gaul, forming a monastery on the south coast of France. So that's what Father Seraphim is talking about here, this preaching the Eastern Church. St. John Cassian has studied in Palestine and in Egypt with the great fathers of the desert, and then went to found his monastery in Gaul. Okay, so present the pure teaching of the Eastern fathers to Western peoples who were spiritually immature and did not yet understand the depth and subtlety of the Eastern spiritual doctrine, and were therefore inclined to go to extremes, either of laxness or over strictness, in applying it to life. St. Cassian sets forth the orthodox doctrine of the royal path in his conference on sober-mindedness or discretion. The conference praised by St. John of the Ladder, this is praised in the Ladder of Divine Ascent, step number 4, paragraph 105, for its, quote, beautiful and sublime philosophy. So even St. John of the Ladder agrees with St. John Cassian about the royal path, okay? And here's a little bit of a long quote from St. John Cassian here. But it lays out this notion very, very well. So, St. John Cassian from this point. With all our strength and with all our effort, we must strive by humility to acquire for ourselves the good gift of sober-mindedness, which can preserve us unharmed by excess from both sides. For as the fathers say, the extremes from both sides are equally harmful, both of excessive fasting and filling the belly, excessive vigil and excessive sleep, and other excesses. Sober-mindedness teaches that a man to go on the royal path, avoiding the extremes on both sides. On the right hand, it does not allow him to be deceived by excessive abstinence, and on the left side to be drawn into carelessness and relaxation. Okay, little comment here. The fathers understand that there are sins of the right hand and sins of the left hand. And the sins on the right hand tend to be over strictness, overzealousness, biting off more than you can chew, rigidity, while the sins of the left hand are typically the sins we think of as the hot sins. So, wine, women, and song, or nowadays sex, drugs, and rock and roll, where it's laxity, it's ease, it's comforts, it's all kinds of self-gratification. And so that when the fathers talk about sins of the right hand, it tends to be too strict. Sins of the left hand tend to be too self-indulgent and loose. Okay, to go on. The temptation on the right side is even more dangerous than that on the left. Quote, excessive abstinence is more harmful than satiating oneself, because with the cooperation of repentance, one may go over from the latter to a correct understanding, but from the former one cannot. That is, because pride over one's virtue stands in the way of repentant humility that could save oneself. And if you want to go read the original text, this is in St. John Cassian, Conferences, Book 2, chapters 16, paragraph 2 and 17. All right, so there's our quotations from Father Seraphim Rose, from St. Basil the Great, from St. John, from Abba Dorotheus, and from St. John Cassian.
Great. Thanks, Father Michael. Yeah. Yeah. So, and for me, this is something that's, when especially you're reading like literature of monastics and these great feats of engagement, and also engaging with non-Christians then, or non-Orthodox Christians, and you kind of see like, oh, we're doing all of these things. And so there can be really this attitude of pride. And I've really been reminded that, as I'm engaging with people, I don't have a lot of Orthodox Christians around myself, then putting other people above myself. I visited Father Zacharias, Elder Zacharias of Essex. The first thing he said to me, says, whenever somebody comes to me, if I have to be able to help that person in any way, I have to be able to put them above myself. And only then can I be able to help them. And so it's one of the real risks in Orthodoxy, in a culture that's going, totally hedonistic and in some ways degenerate. We shouldn't be thinking too highly of ourselves, and that's something that's not easy to do, and that's why we also need to be easy on ourselves, I guess.
We need to be easy on ourselves, and yeah, we've all discovered the pearl of great price, the real treasures of Orthodoxy, and I get it. We're all excited about it, but we have to be real careful not to be triumphalistic about it. We need to receive the faith in humility and not think that we're somehow better than somebody else because we found Orthodoxy. Or even as we sing at the liturgy, we have seen the true light, we have found the true faith. It's true, we have, but let's hold that a little lightly and with humility, because even though we find it, if we're proud, if we're arrogant about that, we can lose it. We can really lose it. And also, if we really have found the pearl of great price, if we really genuinely want to share what we've got with other people, if we want other people to have the same thing that we have to be real careful not to drive them away by being so overbearing and pretentious and arrogant about Orthodoxy. That just turns people off. We found a great thing, tell somebody, come and see. Rather than bash them because they're Catholic or because they're Protestant or because they don't have any faith or whatnot. Just say, come and see. I found something worthwhile here. I think you'd like it. And then let the Holy Spirit work in their hearts.
Yeah. Yeah, I really love, I think we just have it a couple of times a year where we have this song, God is with us. Understand it, all ye nations, and submit yourselves, for God is with us. And I love that. It has this amazingly beautiful, triumphant ring to it. And then I also have to remember that I can enjoy that and stand there with my Orthodox brothers and sisters and know that that's true, that the victory has been won. But then when I meet my, people outside of the church, then I have to know, well, I don't always have God with me. And sometimes my understanding of God is far lower, and I'm far from living that faith in my own life. I actually have so much to learn how to really draw close to God in my own heart as well. So while I'm in the church and experiencing liturgy, then God is with us. But I'm very good at deceiving myself and thinking that my words, by quoting some scripture or some church father somewhere, suddenly I am the word of God. That's, expressing the judgments over the nations or something like that.
It is true. God is with us, s nami Bog, but we are not always with God. I think that might be a way to put it. God is always with us, but we're not always with God. And if we don't walk with God, particularly in our presentation of the faith to other people, we're just going to turn them off. And all of us have seen very obnoxious presentations of Christianity. I lived for 12 years in Dallas, Texas, for example, the buckle of the Bible Belt, where there are street corner preachers with big banners, condemning everyone who doesn't follow their way to hellfire and brimstone and all. And not only did people just ridicule them, but I think they're going to have to answer for a very hateful presentation of Christ's gospel, and drove people away from Christ and his church. I think there's a fault there, and that's why I try to be careful in the way that I speak about Orthodoxy, and I just caution other people too. We don't want to drive people away. We really don't.
So what we thought we're going to do here is that we're going to dive into a topic which we actually have slightly different perspectives on as well, and which I think also has been difficult to handle in many, both inside the church and certainly as soon as we go outside of the church, talking about the subject of evolution. I found
Oh,
if I really want
Lordy.
to kind of lose my credibility in front of a group of non-Christians, I just have to bring up evolution, and it's already like everybody's just completely shifting in the way that they're reacting. So maybe Father Michael, could you start us off with telling me how do you, as an Orthodox priest, or how do you personally, maybe as well? That's probably the most interesting. How do you personally relate to evolutionary theory? What are your thoughts about it? How do you see we should look at it?
Honestly, I
Scientific
think
theory.
about it as little as possible. So forgive me. I know you can't see it on a purely audio podcast, but I think you can almost hear me rolling my eyes when Paul mentioned evolution, because it tends to, it becomes polarizing, because very often the debate over that has been formulated, particularly in America, and there is strong historical reasons for this, going all the way back to the Scopes trial, in the early 20th century, and all of the teaching of evolution in the public schools, and all of that, um, that it tends to be, most people assume that the Christian position on evolution, or any science, issue in modern science, is somehow a fundamentalist Protestant position on it. That you have to read the Bible as a literal scientific text, and that therefore science and the Bible don't agree on something, and so therefore you have to choose one or the other. So you either have to be a scientist and reject Christ and his gospel, or you have to be a Christian and reject modern science. And first of all, I'm not a fundamentalist. I've never been a fundamentalist. I hope never to be one, even as an Orthodox Christian. But also, I think, again, let's do what Father Seraphim Rose says, and let's try to find some grounding in the fathers for our own positions and all. And for those who may not know, I don't think I've mentioned it too much on this podcast, I did my PhD work on St. Maximus the Confessor, and he and I have been kind of buddies. I've been reading him for like going on 30 years. And St. Maximus has this fantastic teaching. It's almost scandalous when you hear it the first time. But he says that the Logos of God, the Logos, was incarnate 3 times. St. Maximus actually says that. He says he was incarnate in the creation, he was incarnate in the scriptures, and he is incarnate in the flesh in the person of Jesus Christ. Being incarnate in creation means that the Logos embodies himself. These are the logi that St. Gregory Palamas talks about so much, in the divine logi of creation. That the one Logos of God, the second person of the Trinity, sort of differentiates himself by expressing the logi, all of these divine energies into the created world, to where the creation reflects the Logos in a very, very intimate way, so much so that St. Maximus will say that the Logos is kind of incarnate in the created order through the divine energies. And then it's the same Logos that revealed himself to the prophets in the scriptures, in the Old Testament, in the law of Moses, and even in the writings of the New Testament. And then, of course, it's the same Logos who took flesh and was born of the Virgin Mary. So if we follow Maximus, and I tend to, because he's my main man, and I think he's right on this, there ultimately cannot be any contradiction between natural science and the scriptures and the Christian life, because it is one and the same Logos that informs every single one of them, that is present and discovered in the created order, in the scriptures, and in the flesh of Jesus Christ. So if there is apparent contradiction between revelation, the scriptures, and the teachings of modern science, then somewhere there's a misunderstanding. And we ought to hold our opinions very, very lightly about modern science, because ultimately I don't believe they can contradict each other. Because the same God who created the universe is the same one who wrote the scriptures and was incarnate for us. And so with evolution, like I say, I don't care. As a theory, I don't care how God made me. I don't care how God created the world, except that he created it and it's very good, and I'm a creature of his and I seek to do his will, but for the mechanics of it, personally, I don't care that much. I know other people care more, and that's perfectly fine. This is one of those areas where no matter, I think there's some room for some prudence here, and prudence allows for reasonable men and reasonably well-informed people to come to different conclusions, because we're pursuing the truth. Because my own, faulty misunderstanding and the passions in my heart are going to darken my own mind to some degree. So I'm not able to perceive the fullness of the truth and to speak as authoritatively on these things. I'm handicapped by my own weaknesses, but so is everybody else who talks about these things. So we will have some disagreements, and I think that's fine.
Mhm. Yeah. So when I came into Orthodoxy, then I was in a parish where the priest, I actually asked him very early on, like, so what's your guys' take on evolutionary theory? I had been a big fan of evolutionary theory before. I had found it incredibly useful for understanding the way that my psyche worked and people around me worked, probably given the animalistic, even bestial approach of some of the ways that my mind was working. But so it actually was a great relief to me when he said to me, oh, yeah, well, we don't see any contradiction between evolution and science. We think that those can go hand in hand. There's nothing wrong. We think that, the biblical stories are more metaphorical and that we're all good there kind of thing. So I was like, oh, okay, great. And then it was actually through my theological studies that one of the set readings was just some excerpts from Father Seraphim Rose's book, Genesis, Man, and Creation. Where Father Seraphim Rose really highlights and makes an incredibly strong case for how the church fathers viewed the creational story as a more literal account happening over, a more limited sense of time, and also how the fall was an incredibly radical shift. I think in the evolutionary story, we often see that kind of like the eating of the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil was something like some kind of evolutionary growth in human consciousness, which is, automatically leading us to higher and higher levels of awareness. And that was just a threshold that we somehow crossed that separated us maybe from other animals, and that we started, worshiping deities or, having an idea of good and evil and things like that. And so it was man, just nature, the forces of nature leading us to higher levels of ability and consciousness. And so when I read these texts from Father Seraphim Rose, I felt really challenged. It was very difficult for me, actually. And I actually just kind of put them aside a little bit and tried to forget about them. And then it was as recently as a year ago or something where I had a conversation with Jay Dyer. And I asked him as well about, well, how do you see the Orthodox position of man and woman and our understanding of the difference between those two things? And what Jay said to me, he said, well, it all depends on, do you actually believe in the creation account in the book of Genesis? And I said, well, of course I do. And he says, well, then he brought out Father Seraphim Rose. It's a big fat book of Genesis, creation, and early man. Not quite as big as his autobiography, but both of them just as amazingly beautiful and pleasurable to read. And he said, this is the book. You need to read this one. So I actually went and read that book, and radically I think slowly my perspective had been changing, and I'd really been seeing the holes in evolutionary theory and the problems with it. But the two big insights that I had that really shifted my perspective in reading that was the fact that evolutionary theory builds on an assumption before you even start that all explanations, all causes, all origins have to be completely naturalistic and material in their essence. You excluded the possibility of God or anything supernatural beforehand.
Yes.
So that is written off as an impossibility, basically, with this theory. And then the other, and that's an obvious one, of course, most people realize that, but they don't really think of the consequences that evolutionary theory is formed on that assumption. And so, if you assume that that's not possible, then of course you're going to have to find some other explanation, right? With evolutionary theory then being, the time kind of becomes your deity that can do the creative work, billions and billions of years of time. But then the other point that really struck me as well was that evolutionary theory also assumes something which is also contradictory to our Christian faith and our understanding of the scriptures, which is that the physical laws of nature have been uniform for all time and for all ages and can never change. They have to be uniform all the time and always. And I think this isn't necessarily something which all of the church fathers have written about or, is universal for them, but many church fathers, I think especially St. Gregory of Nyssa, maybe also St. Maximus the Confessor, I believe, I'm not sure, have expressed that there was a fundamental shift in human beings and their experience of reality, and even the laws of nature themselves that happened with the fall. Death into the world with the fall was, of course, the biggest one. Before that, death did not exist. Man was not said to die. In evolutionary theory, of course, you have to have death for this mechanism to work. People have to die, and there has to be a competitiveness between different races. And so that really seeing those kind of foundational assumptions and knowing from a Christian faith, well, if I believe in God, then I can't just accept these assumptions as absolutes whatsoever. And then that opens up the possibility for, okay, well, the founders of modern science all believed in a creator God. I've been watching actually a little bit of you could call him a Protestant fundamentalist, the Stephen Meyer guy, who's actually been having interviews with Jonathan Peugeot, and been on Joe Rogan as well, I saw, and making a really strong scientific case for, all of the founders of science all assumed a creator God. And actually, modern science is founded on that very idea. And science doesn't really make sense. The entire idea of truth doesn't make sense unless you actually, in an evolutionary perspective, if we're just a product of, a kind of fight for survival, then we cannot trust our own sense data whatsoever, because how do I know the things that I'm sensing actually correspond to reality? It could just be what's most prudent for me. There are examples where I sense things that aren't there because it's just helpful for me to survive. If I hear a rustling in the bushes, I think it's a lion, and so I run off, but it doesn't make it a lion there, right? And there could be even more foundational, fundamental faults in my perception of reality, and I don't know how I can know that. But as a Christian, I believe that God created me in his own image, and I believe that I can actually perceive reality. And so that's something that I have trust in. I have faith in that. And I can actually even come to know the ultimate reality, which is God himself, by following the approach laid out in Holy Scripture, in the divine services of the church as well. And so for me, all of this has meant, sorry for the long conversation, long thing, but it's meant that I've come far closer to, God feels a lot closer to me. I feel like before, in billions of years, and God became far more an abstract kind of thing that was far away and not really active in the world, but in a much more grounded understanding. Then suddenly, without the evolutionary view, I feel far more intimately connected with him, my creator, and so that I just notice how it engages my love for God as well, and strengthens me in every aspect of my life.
There you go. Yeah, actually, you say that very well, and you summarize the points really well. And I have nothing. I got nothing to say against anything that you have said. And just to recap, my own position, I don't really care about evolutionary theory whatsoever. I just want to be able to find whatever the truth is going to agree. Science must agree with Scripture, which must agree with Christian revelation, and somehow those all have to work hand in hand, and not undermine each other. And again, I go back to St. Maximus the Confessor on that one.
Yeah.
So I'm willing to hold any kind of, all of my personal opinions. I try. I fail often, but I try. All of my personal opinions and things, that I know are not grounded in the Gospels, I try to hold very, very lightly, and try to be willing to change my perspective, on some things, if, in light of new revelation, in light of new truth. But we always seek the truth. We always seek Christ. And if we do that, I think he'll guide us into the fullness of his truth, because he is the truth, the way, the truth, and the life. He tells us that. So sincere pursuit of it ought to lead us to Christ.
Yeah. So there's another guy that I just interviewed recently who's a well-known Danish manosphere influencer, who I found out was actually evangelical Christian, attending a Hillsong church. And we were talking and agreeing about a whole lot of different stuff. But I noticed that he would, in his language, he'd be using kind of evolutionary language as well. And so I decided to kind of go out on a limb and say, like, hey, dude, like, we're talking a lot about all the kind of lies of mainstream society that he'd kind of like broken through and seen through. And so I said, well, this evolutionary thing, that's a part of it. It's a part of it. I really believe that it's making us believe that we're animals, that that we're separated, and in that way we're far more just these instinctual things that are kind of responding to whatever it is. And so it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when I believe that about man, human nature, that I'm just basically the same as any other animal. Then I lose that ability to control myself. And so I said this to him, and he received it kind of okay, but his audience probably hasn't. I think it's been, it kind of puts you out there as the fundamentalist as well. So I also pray that God gives me grace not to scare people away with my kind of, Bible bashing fundamentalism or church fathers bashing things, because certainly facts and truth are not the same thing. Truth requires love, and love requires wisdom, and understanding and discernment. And I don't know if I always have that. So, just bringing this out and smashing people on the head with it probably isn't always the right way to do things.
Isn't good. Like I say, and I've seen so much of that around evolution, I mean, even substantive issues like more substantive issues like abortion,
Yeah,
um, sexuality, all of those sorts of things. I
yeah,
just find it just gets everybody's, you know, hackles raised so much that it's really not possible to have a rational discussion
yeah,
about these things. And if all it's going to do is upset other people or cause flame wars online or something, I don't know that it's very helpful really to go there.
yeah. I have
I
my
really,
biological brother. He believes that Donald Trump is yeah, some kind of, really evil, bad, idiotic, stupid man or something like that. And it's really hard to know how to deal with that. And what I find is most of the time I just have to listen to him and try and understand him better, ask questions. Because if I kind of try and go up against him on specific issues, I don't, it's just going to push him away. And I don't, that's not, it's important for me to, I'm in for the long haul with him, right? So I do
yeah,
believe that in
yeah.
the end, the truth will come out.
Yeah, and I know probably everybody in all of their families has people of differing political perspectives and persuasions. I know in my congregation, I have the full spectrum of American political life in my congregation. I mean, including the radical extremes on both sides. I really do, So I've learned to walk a very careful path,
Mhm.
and not to speak to those things directly myself because you can't go near them without offending people, and because everyone's just reactive about it. It's not a rational argument. It's more of a reactive, emotional, knee-jerk thing, and that's really not helpful.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
we've in the last few years, probably the last about 8, 10 years, we've lost a lot of the capacity for sort of reasoned discourse where, for example, if Paul were of a completely different political persuasion than I could be, that we could still be friends and we could agree to disagree and we could have, we could sit on the patio and drink beer and talk about our political differences, but we're still friends, through the whole thing. And at the end of the night, we're still pals. And that's increasingly difficult nowadays. And it's just the climate we're in. So I don't see much profit in going there,
Yeah.
rather than, and and sort of this it's actually kind of grounded in a Christian approach because if we just seek God, if we're not going to engage in worldly debates of any kind, but simply follow Christ, then I think the witness of our lives that we have peace,
Mhm.
that our hearts are at peace, that we can raise our children well, that we can engage with kindness and charity and compassion with everybody around us, regardless of any human differentiation. If we can just simply live positively Christian lives, I think that is a good witness. I think it's also good enough witness to where, like I say, with I roll my eyes at evolution, I roll my eyes at a lot of stuff nowadays, and I don't know, maybe it's just because I'm old and tired, and I'll freely own up to that part, you know. But if I can just, cultivate the little garden that Christ has given me and try to be a good servant and disciple of His,
Mhm.
it seems to be enough. And there's not a whole lot that I can do about the rest of the world anyway. Um, with regards to, yeah, I mean, I'll vote in the election. That's the limit of my abilities to do
Political
anything about
engagement.
it. So
Yeah.
I don't find it helpful to worry with it too much. I discovered personally that if I paid too much attention to the news, that it just made my anxiety go up. And then I was worried all the time. And my prayer was not at peace. My heart wasn't at peace. And I found I wasn't as much good to myself or to anybody else around me.
Mhm.
And so I just found for myself, you can't get away from the news or world events because they're everywhere. But I don't have to, sit and watch them on the evening news. I don't have to have the radio on a news channel all of the time. And I don't need to spend every waking moment, scrolling, news media online.
Yeah.
And I just find, I can regain a little bit of my peace. And sometimes people are kind of amazed. I think it actually helps my ministry, if I
I'm
can be a
sure.
little
I'm
more,
sure.
little more at peace than the rest of the world.
Yeah. I mean, we're talking here this morning after I assume you've also managed to somewhere it's popped up on your screen that Joe Biden just fell out of the presidential
Oh,
race in the United
yes.
States. So and it's kind of becoming a banana show. I think the rest of us outside of America are thinking like, what on earth are you guys up to over there? It's just a big
We
joke.
don't
But
we
I
don't
actually
know
just
what
read
we're up to.
yeah, and it's concerning. It's very concerning
Yeah.
actually. It is a yeah. But I read something from St. Paisios, which really helped me a lot because I think I have the tendency, as you said, to like I don't get anxious, but I get angry actually, and
Oh,
there's a part of me that enjoys being angry. I also enjoy watching like MMA fights and seeing guys like bashing each other to pieces. So, but I
we'll
really feel
talk,
this
Paul.
anger from
We'll
following
talk.
politics.
Okay.
Sorry.
So we'll talk.
Yeah. Um, but um, but yeah, I can kind of swing between this anger and then a cynicism,
Mhm.
and feeling engaged, but then not engaged, not doing anything, and then
Yeah.
it can into a kind of like a passivity, I think. And this is where I think also some people can mistake this idea of the royal path for like, well, then I just kind of like sit back and go with the flow or don't do anything or something like that, right? And
Mhm.
that's what we're called to. We're called to actually have discernment and wisdom and to stand firm, especially in our own lives and in our own gardens as well. And so someone actually came to St. Paisios the Athonite and asked him, Joanda, who should I vote for in this election? In some Greek election, I assume it was. And he came up with two principles that he said were important. He certainly didn't say don't vote. What he said, look at which candidate loves God the most, and then secondly, which candidate loves his country the most, because those are the two things that are going to prevent him from acting in self-interest and just basically ruining things. And that can keep in mind is a true love for God, of course, is the most important thing, but then also to love your country because he's there to serve the country, and so he should be in the way that Christ gave himself because of his great love for mankind. Then this man should be able to give himself for his country as well. And so someone who can truly express and has a heartfelt love for his country, that's something that's worthwhile. And this person was asking then said to him, well, what if I think that all of the politicians are just as bad and they're equally wrong? And St. Paisios, he answered very wisely. He said, well, take the olive tree. Olive trees, they're all the same. They're all just olive trees. But there's a specific sickness there where he was living that olive trees often got. And so he says, well, some of these olive trees, they'll have this sickness 50%. Some of them will have them 80%. Some of them might even have them 90%. But they're also olive trees, and some of them will probably still be producing some kind of fruit, even if they have this sickness. And so we take the olive tree, we prioritize the olive tree that has the least of the sickness and that's producing the best fruit. And that's the one that we do it for. And so I think for me, that's something that, personally, I can tend towards. I didn't vote in the last European parliamentary elections. I thought this is a joke. It's ridiculous. It's a Tower of Babel, horribly, it's a terrible system that I have no idea, no wish to be a part of. And looking back at it now, I actually realized like, no, I was actually not fulfilling my responsibility as a man by just at least going down and using half an hour of my time to go down and cast my vote, at least for somebody who, there's plenty of politicians who are completely against that entire, megalomaniac project that they're building down there. And so I realized like there is a responsibility to do something, and I look for a candidate who loves God and loves his country. And then I put my trust in, God puts us under the people that he puts us under authority for a reason.
Yes.
And so
Yeah.
we trust God by being obedient to our authorities. We want to be good citizens, even when we don't agree with our rulers and all the details of
Oh,
what.
yeah. Yeah. I noticed that over the course of 29 years now as a priest, I think I've been through 7 presidencies over the course of
Mhm,
my priesthood because we elect every 4 years.
mhm.
And they change parties. And I continue to pray for this God protected land as president for all those in civil authority and for those in the service of our country, regardless of their party, and the church always does. And that's it, you know. Sometimes my heart inclines one way, and sometimes my heart, sometimes I pray for them, God save us from them,
Yeah.
Other times my heart inclines to say, oh, goody, please encourage them. I like the way this is going. But, so is everyone else in the congregation. And I think, what unites us all is that we want the best for our country, and we love our country, and we do love God as well. So, if we just put it into God's hands and trust him, and
Yeah.
I think there's somewhere, if you scrounge around in the New Testament, you'll find it somewhere, that God does is in charge of the rulers who are placed over us as well. That's sort of a biblical principle. So,
God is with us, so submit
maybe that
yourselves. Yes.
adage, we get the rulers we deserve, actually has some biblical foundation.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're orientated not towards this world, but the world to come. And so
Oh,
there's a spiritual dimension. This has been the massive insight for me coming into Orthodoxy, because I think as a Protestant Christian, I still kind of thought that, riches and power and status in this world went hand in hand with my spiritual journey. And I
mm,
realized more and more like, no, those are more often opposed to each other.
no.
And our great heroes of the faith, these are men. What I can't remember the verse that Paul says, but they lived in caves and they were beaten and
Yeah, and pillars,
persecuted.
Hebrews, yeah, and in pits of the earth, yeah. They went about,
Yeah.
naked and beaten and all of that. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
forget, one of the desert fathers, I think it was, also said, I said, how do we live in the world? And he says, our Christian life ought to be like a wheel.
Mhm.
So the wheel touches the ground, but only at a very small place. And that's how we touch the world. The rest of our life is lived apart from the world. So we touch it only to the degree that we have to. And granted, that's easy for a monk to say.
Yeah.
And for those of us, who are more like spiritual flat tires, there's a whole lot more of us touching the ground maybe than we would like. But again, to hold that engagement lightly, not to be sucked into it, maybe not to be so concerned with things that are above our control or outside of our control, to pay
Mhm.
attention to our own responsibilities, to care well for the little realm that's been given us to govern, be that our families, our businesses, our local communities, the people that are in our sphere. Set a good example for them. Pray for them.
Mhm.
Just yesterday's gospel for us was, the healing of the centurion servant, and that was one of the points that one of the fathers made, and I mentioned in my sermon. The centurion didn't come for his own needs. He loved his servant so much to come and to intercede with Christ for his servant. And so let's be sure that we also pray for each other. Pray for your political, candidate. Pray for the other guy too. Pray
Mhm.
for the people that agree with you. Pray for the people who don't agree with you. Because, and again, to go back to our time in Essex last month, it was said to me, I think at least 3 times, just in passing, that it was one of the great teachings of St. Silouan of Mount Athos, repeated by St. Sophrony of Essex, that the true measure of a Christian is love for his enemies. And if we exclude anybody from our heart, this is dereliction of Christian duty. So even those people on the other side, we have to find a way to love them as well.
Yeah. Christ came not for the righteous, but for
And to
sinners,
save
and
sinners.
so
Yeah.
and for the sick. So yeah. Thank you, Father Michael. I think this has been great. And I'll just finish off by saying, if anybody would like to join in the company of other men seeking the royal path, then we have the Cry of the Forerunner retreat coming up in September. Details on the Average to Alpha website in the show notes below. And in October, I still have a couple of places, although they're going quickly. There's a couple of places for a trip to Mount Athos. There's a couple of guys coming from everywhere, from Bulgaria to Denmark to United States. I think I have a guy from Arizona who just signed up yesterday, booked his flights.
Sweet.
So I'm really looking forward to having a trip over there. We're going to be able to have an audience with Father Ephraim of the Vatopedi Monastery, and we're told that we'll be able
Oh,
to do
sweet.
some physical work at the monasteries as well, helping them with the physical labor. I'm really happy to do that, because the last time I was in Mount Athos, we just walked around and talked and drank tea and had nice little sweet things to eat. So
Yeah. Ate
as well
Turkish
as some
delight and
ouzo we
drank
got as well.
ouzo. Yeah, I know what you did.
Good. Okay. Anything to add at the end here, Father Michael, from you?
No, it's been beautiful. It's been beautiful. And again, I'll just finish off this as I sometimes do, especially when we're talking about issues where we did quote the fathers in what we said, but much of what we talked about was our own personal opinions, and our grasping forward as best we can to arrive at the truth. Our purpose here is not to give offense to anybody. Forgive me if I gave offense to anybody in anything that I said. It was not my intention. In all things, check, what we say against the gospel. Check everything that we say against the Holy Fathers as well. And always, in that respect, follow the royal path too.
Mhm. And I'll just say, listen to the much older, wiser priest guy than myself if I have said anything. But also, please, yeah, thank you, and forgive me if I've said anything offensive. Thanks, Father Michael.
Thank you, Paul.